here for whatever reason.
Sure, would like to have.
Yeah, so I put the recordings up. I've got a Google Drive where like people want to read my outlines. It's mostly just me reminding myself of what happened in the chapter, plus the quotations. So this week we read selections from Genesis 13, 15, 18, and 22, which is a lot of stuff. And just to get us to where we need to be introductory-wise, because we didn't do the flood and we didn't do Tower of Babel, we missed kind of that, like, we talked about Noah, that one faithful member of the generation. Well, then we have the flood narrative, which I want to do in a full class. And then you see the Tower of Babel, that rebellion again. And we see this over and over and over again. God calls the faithful, God sends this salvation event, and then there's a rebellion again. And so Tower of Babel, you see the dispersal of the nations, and then that list of genealogies of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, like lead out through the various nations around the ancient Near East. And then we pick up one person again. God calls the family of Haran. God calls Abraham, Abram's family, and tells them to leave Ur, Chaldea, modern day Iraq, and move. Just pick up everything and go to a land that I'm going to show you. Now again, we'll talk about that in more detail when we actually get a chance to do a fuller lesson, but that kind of is this pivotal point. Genesis 1 through 6 really act as a prologue for the book of Genesis. This is where we come from, former slaves, children of Israel. This is where we're going to the promised land, just like Abram. We're going back to the garden. We're going back to the restoration of the relationship between God and man. That's where they're heading on the Exodus. They're heading back to the garden, as it were, and in Canaan. And now we start to pick up what I would consider really the narrative story of Genesis. Everything up to this point has been introductory. Where did we come from? What's the story of humanity? How did we get so many different peoples? Where did all these nations come from? And now, and who is the God that we worship? Now we have the role of the individual, the role of the family, the role of the clan, the role of the tribe starts to flesh itself out. Where are we going to? How do we get to the Exodus? How do we get to this place in the desert now? And where are we going in the rest of even the Old Testament? So there has been, God has brought, Abram's father decides not to go all the way to Canaan. He stops. But it's good here. We'll stay here. Stay in Haran, it'll be great. We'll be happy here. And God calls Abram specifically. I called your father, he's not going to follow me any further. I'm calling you. You, take your wife, take your nephew, take everybody who will come with you, including your slaves and your handmaidens, your cattle and your tents and everything, and you follow me. And I will bring you to the land that we're going. Abram crosses the Jordan, he goes into Canaan, he sets an altar up to this God who has called him. And there's wonderful legends about Abram, kind of his life leading into this call from God. About, just kind of his dissatisfaction with polytheism, his realization that like there's more to, there is a greater power, a greater truth. There is a God above the gods. And that's how God reveals himself to Abram. And we read that in Pre-Sanctified Liturgy, I think not this week, but it was this week, I don't remember. But like, I am the Lord Most High, El Shaddai, God, the highest God. I'm the God you've been looking for. I'm the highest God. And that's how God reveals himself to Abram in Canaan. And Abram starts to set himself up. He's got his flocks and his herds, he's got his tents, and he's got his people, and all these people, they start to thrive, really, in Canaan. They have favor with the Canaanites. There's a lot of positive back and forth. And then there's a famine. And instead of staying in Canaan, relying on this God who has called him out of everything he always knew and led him to a land that he promised him, Abram goes to Egypt. And we're going to see this over and over and over and over and over and over again in the Old Testament. I once heard a pastor refer to this as the Egyptian option. Whenever things get hard and it's true, whenever things get hard for Abram or the Israelites in general, they go to Egypt. It never fails. Abram goes to Egypt because of a famine. Abram beds an Egyptian woman because his wife is barren. Isaac will go into Egypt. Eventually Jacob will go into Egypt. It's almost always because there's a famine. I'm just realizing this. Famine of food or famine of children, we're going to go to Egypt. We're going to figure this out. And it's in Egypt where they're eventually enslaved, right? That's what the final outcome of this Egyptian decision is, that they're eventually enslaved. And they're there for 480 years before God frees them and brings them to the promised land. Abram goes into Egypt, and what's he do? He tells his wife to lie. Tell everyone you're my sister. Because you're beautiful, they're gonna kill me and take you as their wife. I just know it's gonna happen. So Abram, not trusting God in Canaan, chooses to go to Egypt and find strength and power under Pharaoh's protection. And then continues to rely on his own understanding and lie to the people. This is my wife. Which works just great until Pharaoh sees Abram and Sarah alone in a garden. He goes, oh wow, for a sister, you two sure are friendly. And Pharaoh ends up casting him out. And I think this is an interesting thing to realize. Abram begins to learn that he needs to trust God and not his own power, his own wisdom, and not earthly powers. Abram goes into Egypt with weakness, relying on Pharaoh. But right here in chapter 13, when Pharaoh casts him out, Abram was very rich in cattle, silver, and gold. So he went out of Egypt. He escapes the temptation of Egypt, this temptation to rely on himself. When the truth finally comes out and he leaves Egypt and he goes back to Canaan, he leaves with blessing. He leaves better than he left with. He fled the temptation. He was caught in it for a while, but he didn't dwell there. He didn't stay forever, deceiving Pharaoh, deceiving himself. St. John Chrysostom on this passage is saying, if the devil has got such a power to pull you from your exalted height and virtue, down into Egypt, if you will, down to such an extent of evil, so you're relying on man and not on God, so how much would God's power be to lift you back to your original status? He would not only get you back to what you were, but would make you better. Do not despair and do not throw away the good hope. Do not fall as the atheists did. It is not the great number of sins that leads to despair, but it's the lack of a pious soul. Like Abram chooses not to trust God. He goes into Egypt, and what he receives in Egypt it's not good for him. Pharaoh's like, get out. But he doesn't just leave empty-handed. He doesn't say, leave me, you owe me for all this time you've spent with me. He's increased while in Egypt. He leaves with his cattle and his herds, and silver and gold go with him. Another time, Chrysostom says, God is offended by our unwillingness to change far more than the magnitude of the evil we committed. Whoever sinned would fall into human weakness, but he who persists on sinning would cancel his humility and turn it into a devil. Abram has a choice. Continue to rely on Egypt, continue to rely in the riches of the temptation, the power of Pharaoh, or to leave and return to Canaan. The famine's not over in Canaan. But he's realized his sin, he's realized what this temptation to rely on Egypt has done to him. I've been a liar. I've deceived. I've cast aspersions on my wife. I've turned my back on this God who called me and said he would bless me, and through whom all generations would be blessed. He's learned to be rich both in spirit and in material things. He's learned to reject the physical temptation, and he's received a spiritual blessing. He's learned to reject the temptation of Egypt, the strength and the power of Pharaoh, receive even a material blessing by following God. And then you have his next trial. The famine was one thing in Canaan. I'm going to rely on Egypt. The next trial is that they get back into Canaan, and what happens? He and his people and his nephew's people start fighting. They start to argue. Lot's people argue with Abram's people. Which is funny when you think about, like, God has said, bring all your people with you, and this whole land is going to be yours. Well, then the slaves start fighting each other, the servants start fighting each other, the shepherds start fighting each other, And so the the patriarch and his right-hand man, his nephew, decide to part ways. Let's not have any enmity. Your people can't get along with my people. Let's just part ways. Let's call it like it is. And interestingly, Lot has attached himself to Abram. He follows Abram because he sees Abram, the blessing that God is giving Abram. Abram says, follow me. The highest God in heaven has called me to this place. He's going to bless me there. He's going to bless all the people with me, and Lot's like, I'm with you. He doesn't stay behind with Haran. He goes with Abram. And see where this God leads you. Well, this God led you to Canaan. It's great here, but famine. And that whole Egypt thing happened. That was embarrassing. Now we're back here. There's still not enough food. There's still not enough pasture land. Is this really working? And we're told that Lot is rich with flocks and tents, but not that he has silver and gold. Abram is said to have flocks and tents and silver and gold, which the fathers interpret as these physical and spiritual blessings. He has the flocks and tents, those are physical blessings. He has silver and gold, those are spiritual blessings. The word and spirit of God are with him. We're told that we're not told that Lot has those things. He's attached himself to Abraham's physical blessings, but not to the spiritual blessings. He has not worshipped Abram's God. And I think we see that in the decision of Lot. So, foreshadowing. Also, interesting note, Lot's name means to cover. It's a veil. It's something you hide something in. Lot's faith is kind of hidden behind Abram's blessings. Abram's faith at this point is wide open. I'm going to trust God here, whatever it takes, because I'm not going to make the same mistake and go to Egypt again. And we see that when they have their conversation. Lot, in his arrogance, takes the first place. He doesn't defer to the older man. He doesn't defer to the patriarch, the one who's leading the clan. Abram says, you pick, and wherever you go, I'll go the other direction. And Lot doesn't say, no, you pick, I submit to you. Lot chooses. Lot and Abram have a different view of what they're seeing. Abram defers to Lot, even though it's a mark of humility that Lot should have said no. But Abram still honors Lot's choice. Lot chooses to go to Sodom, again attaching himself to earthly power. The twin cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were, at the time, powerful, rich, influential cities. They're right at the edge of the Dead Sea. There's a lot of trade that went back and forth between the two sides of the Dead Sea. Now it's nothing. I've been there. It's literally nothing but smoke. And I have pieces of brimstone from Sodom that are that big. You can see kind of the outlines of the walls where they used to be. But all around it, you can see you look around it, all the land around it is beautiful. It's green, it's lush, there's rich and fertile soil, but this one section is completely barren, completely empty, just by way of context. Abram lifts up his eyes and recalls Eden. He recalls the promise, everything that Eden represents, the fellowship with God. And so he chooses to stay with God, chooses to stay in Canaan. Lot casts his eyes into the valley, in the direction of Egypt. Sodom is south, towards Egypt. Those are the powerful cities. I'll link myself to them. We see in Lot in Lot we see the spirituals are intermixed with worldly, with no separation or discernment. Here he represents the religious person who has the theoretical knowledge and the formal practice, while his heart is drowned in the love of the world and crawling on the ground. Lot has been with Abram. He's seen the blessings of God. He understands this God. He's willing to follow it so long as the blessings are attached to it, but he'd rather attach himself to the world. And God tells Abram, after that, Abram is discouraged. We've separated the blessing that you promised me. We're losing people. We're losing people here. Is this the cost of obedience? And what does God tell Abram to do? He says in verse 14, then God said to Abram, after Lot separated from him, lift up your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, westward, and all the land you see I give to you and your seed forever, and I will make your seed as the dust of the earth. And if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your seed could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its breadth, for I will give it to you. Then Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the oak of Mamre in Hebron and built an altar there to the Lord. The first thing Abram does when he crosses the Jordan into Canaan is build an altar to the Lord. He builds an altar to the God who's revealed himself. The next thing he does after Egypt, after the Lot separation, is he walks the length and breadth of the land. God tells him, get up and walk, move. Don't be discouraged, because everything here is yours. And so Abram begins his great missionary work. He sets up another altar right in the smack center of the main roads, because it's by the Jordan, it's by the water. Everyone's going to have to go by that altar. And he begins this great work of establishing the worship of God in Canaan. And then in 15, you have to jump 14. 14 is a great story if you want to read it on your own. Kings of the north, the Canaanite kings all gather together because the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and a couple other kings have decided not to pay tribute. So they gather a big army and they go and they ransack the cities, they capture all these people, including Lot. And Abram gathers 318 fighting men together, and he goes and he rescues Lot and the kings of Sodom and all these things. So we have this great, we often make this connection. Abram goes with 318 fighting men and rescues Lot. Well, there were 318 bishops at the first council. Like, we're going to rescue the church from heresy. It's a great story, and I love it, but it's Christ in the Old Testament, maybe not so much. But you have the Melchizedek story. Christ is forever a priest in the order of Melchizedek. And rather than, that could probably be its own lecture, the King of Peace, the righteous King of Peace, Melchizedek means righteous king, and he's the King of Salem, what is now Jerusalem. But he was one of the local Canaanite kings, but he's this king no one knows anything about. And he's this priestly king. He comes and he blesses Abram. He brings him bread and wine. And Abram gives him a tenth of everything he's received. Abram won't receive, and I'll stop here because it leads into the covenant story. All the kings that Abram helped fight with offer him like a share of wealth. Like, we're going to split it all with you. And he's like, I don't want it. I'll take what I took, but don't let anybody say that I made Abram rich. Nuh-uh. I don't owe you tribute. I don't owe you a thing. I came and helped you of my own free will. I'm going to take the plunder that I've taken, but I don't want any of yours. Let no one say that they've made Abram rich. He's not going to. Lot attaches himself to Sodom. I will be wealthy and I'll be well off because of Sodom. Abram has already done that. He's tried that in Pharaoh. I'll do well because Pharaoh's doing well. Now he's going to choose to trust God. And we see that because as soon as this priestly king comes out and offers Abram bread and wine, Abram offers him a tithe. He takes a tenth of everything he's received in this battle and gives it willingly, gladly, to this priestly king. Let no one say that I've made Abram rich. I will attach myself to the spiritual blessings that God has for me here in this place. And so after these things, after the battle, this is 15:1, after the battle, after the rescue of Lot, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, and I will be your exceedingly great reward. Now, nowhere to this point have we heard that Abram is afraid. Abram wasn't afraid to go rescue Lot. Abram wasn't afraid to meet Melchizedek. Abram wasn't afraid to tell the kings no. But God approaches Abram and reveals himself and tells him not to fear. I've come to you. Come to me. I will be your shield. I'll be close to you. I'll protect you. I'll be with you. And we start to see this back and forth. The closer God gets to Abram, the closer Abram gets to God. The closer Abram gets to God, the closer God gets to Abram. They move to each other. Don't be afraid. This is what I promised you. Then think back to Adam. Adam's hiding. God comes to Adam and Adam hides in the bushes. Where are you? God comes to Abram. Don't be afraid. I'm here. I'm here. I told you I would be here. All these things that have happened to me, I told you I'd be here. But Abram said, Lord, will you give me, seeing as I am childless, the heir of my house, Eliezer of Damascus, the son of my domestic maidservant? He said, you promised me children. You promised me generation. You promised my seed would inherit the land. Is it going to go to the son of my maidservant? Is that the best I've got? Is this inheritance through this hired woman? And God promises him not the son of a maidservant, but his own son. And it's at this point, this is Abram believed God. And we see this repeated again and again. St. Paul says it over and over and over and over again. St. James says it. Abram believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. Abram chooses to believe God. Not to question, not to equivocate. He chooses to believe God. And then he requests a sign. Not as a sign of lack of faith, but if you're truly the God who's revealing himself to me, who's going to bless me and my seed forever, if you're going to give me children, you're going to give me generation, let's cut a covenant. Let's make it real. Let's make it happen. And in the word in Hebrew for a covenant is a cutting. There's blood in this covenant. If you remember reading in the story, Abram gathers all these animals together and slices them down the middle and separates the pieces. And then God walks through the midst of the pieces and says, let it be done to me. God is speaking. Let it be done to me if I fail to keep my covenant. Well, God's a unity, right? Trinity and unity. He's a wholeness, a perfect simplicity of wholeness. He can't be separated from himself. And so it's just like, there, evidence. I can't be divided, and so it's going to all happen. But that sign, there's a lot. I kept digging and digging and digging. There's just so much in the animals that are chosen and the way that they're prepared and the way that the covenant works itself out, this moment between God and Abram, that you start to see. That would take forever to really fully unpack. But that sign of the covenant sign came to reveal the mystery of the church coming out of the person of Abram. God promising to grant him descendants from his body, innumerable as the stars in the heavens, now revealing to him to these descendants, who will be those who are children of Abraham by faith, which will be the church to God. Those separate parts will be joined together. The circumcised and the uncircumcised. The stranger and the family. All these different parts will be joined together. The church is going to be made up of separate pieces pulled together in faith. We can say that what happened to Abram here refers to the redeeming work of Christ. When the sun went down, we're told in Genesis, at the fulfillment of time, after Abram has prepared the sacrifice and chased away the vultures, deep sleep fell upon Abram. Well, deep sleep is on Christ, right? He dies. He yielded up, Christ yields up his spirit on the cross, proclaiming the bitterness of sin that brought us, all of us, down into hell and delivering us unto servitude for some time. But the Lord, sleeping on the cross, ascending into hell, carries us on his shoulders as he comes into the grave and out of it again. In the same way, Abram is in this deep sleep and the Spirit of God walks between these divided pieces, symbolizing this fulfillment of the promise back to Adam and Eve. I'm going to bring you back from all the places of the world. We've seen what happened to the descendants of Noah. They've been scattered all over creation. If you reread that section in Genesis 11, we see the nations peopled. And we even see nations cursed. Cursed be Ham. A slave to Shem slave to Shem. Cursed be Ham. And we see these nations scatter. Well, in Abram, God is going to be bringing all those nations back together again through his seed, through his descendants. The church will come from all nations, all peoples. There won't be any tribe or tongue, circumcised or uncircumcised, Jew nor Greek, barbarian, nobody. All those broken parts are brought together again. And I've lost the page of notes, but that's okay, because I know what's happening in them anyway. God then approaches Abram again. God then approaches Abram again in chapter 18. And just an interlude, God has had this great division of these people. You cut this covenant kind of with the world. And again, the fathers just keep digging into the types of animals that are chosen and why they're the age they are, and heifers and goats and all these things. And the turtle doves aren't split in half; they're kept whole. There's just a lot, and it would take forever to take more time than we have in this class to really unpack in one day. Then God gives Abram a physical sign for himself, and that's the sign of circumcision, which becomes important. I mean, it's certainly important as far as when you look at Paul's theology. Circumcise your heart, circumcise your eyes, circumcise your ears. You know, it's not meant to be just a physical action. It's meant to be a spiritual result of this covenant relationship between God and man. God cuts all these animals, and then he tells Abram to cut himself. Because the promise is for generation, the promise is for children. We're all grown-ups here. Put even your reproductive system into my hands. I will produce children. And all your sons, and all your sons. And so you see the circumcision, the covenant of circumcision, which includes even Ishmael, just as an interesting thought. God promises Abram a son. You're going to have a son. And he renames him. Avram means great father. Abraham means father of greatness, like lots of children. And he's like, well, won't you just bless Ishmael? Like, it was so easy. Like, we have a baby already. Can't you just bless Ishmael? I was like, I do bless Ishmael, but that's not the promised son. But Ishmael's not rejected. He's not thrown out of the covenant blessings for Abraham. He's just not the promised son. And so God returns to Abraham in chapter 18. God approaches Abraham again. God keeps coming again. As Abraham draws close to God, God draws close to Abraham. And it's just this constant reciprocal relationship of getting closer and closer and closer and more intimate with each other. This reflection of an Adam relationship. Obviously a reflection of a Christ relationship. Christ says, I and the Father are one because everything the Father does, I do. Everything the Father says, I say. Everything the Father thinks, I think. We're one. We're a union. And God approaches Abraham again. And Abraham approaches God again. This time again in love and humility, not in fear, not in trepidation. He comes out, he greets God. You know, these three visitors come to him at the oak at Mamre, where he's built this altar. Where else is God going to meet him? The altar, where he built him. And God has come to reveal himself to Abraham. He says, will I hide myself from what I plan to do? He reiterates his promise of a son. Sarah laughs. God says, by next year, I'm going to come again and she's going to have a child. And then God says in verse 16, the men get up, and Abraham goes along with them to escort them kind of out of the encampment. And then the Lord says, shall I hide from Abraham, my servant, what I'm about to do? God is looking to reveal himself. He's looking for intimacy. He's looking for this co-regency that he created in Adam. And so God comes to reveal this plan to Abraham. Abraham's kind of this perfect example in the Old Testament of what it looks like when people try and live out that relationship with God that was intended from the beginning, of humility and service and love and worship, true submission. Every time Abraham does that, his relationship with God gets deeper and deeper and deeper. So he's almost too good to be true. And I think there's a level at which Abraham, of course, being this wonderful archetypal figure in the Old Testament, everything goes back to Abraham. Children of Abraham. I'm the God of Abraham. Like, his feats, his exploits, his faith. Moses is like, this is the guy we come from. I know 400 years in slavery, that's hard. But look at who we came. Look, we come from good stock. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. God talked to them face to face. We haven't heard God in 400 years. I know. But God talked to these men face to face, like a man talks to his friends. Like, that's what God wants. That's the God we're going to worship. That's the God we're going to Canaan to meet. That's the God who's right in front of us in that shining, right in front of us in that pillar of cloud, in that pillar of fire. That's the God who's behind us keeping the Egyptians at bay. That's the God at the tabernacle. That's the God who came down on Sinai and you were too afraid to go talk to. That's the one. He came close to you. Sorry. Just it's an interesting moment. God approaches the Israelites at Sinai. And they say to Moses, you go talk to him, we can't do it. But he didn't come just to talk to Moses. He came to reveal himself to Israel, the children of Abraham, the people who are journeying to himself by faith. And they say, that's a little more than we're able to take right now. Which is obvious because the next thing they do is build a giant golden calf. Anyway. But this is the relationship that we see. And this, you see this in Abraham, these moments of spiritual revelation, these moments of God drawing near every now and then. God finally draws near to humanity by taking on flesh. Like he finally fully draws near to us by becoming one of us and taking on humanity in the incarnation. And God tells Abram the sins of Sodom are filled up. Their wickedness has called out, like the very ground calls out against them. Their sin is so great. Think about back to Abel. The blood cries out to me from the ground. Sodom's sins have reached their peak. Just like right before the flood. Man's sin has reached its peak. I can't allow it to keep going. The hideousness of man was revealed in the extent of his evil. The sins were so manifest, asking for the chastening of their doers. And the earth, the voiceless creation, no longer standing that corruption, is now moaning out to God, seeking for judgment. How long, O Lord? And God comes down to see it for himself, like he did at Babel. The ancient world, your gods are so separate, they're so distant, they ride on storm clouds, they're these great powers you can't comprehend, they're rivers, oceans, crops, and fields, whatever, mountains. But the God of Abraham, the God we worship, the God who is revealed in Christ, is the God who comes down to us. God came to Adam. He knew Adam sinned. He came to the garden. Where are you? You sinned. Come back to me. God comes down and talks to Noah. He's seen the evil in the world. He comes down and he finds Noah. And he saves the whole world. God comes down to Babel. And he sees the sin of Babel. He comes down. He's present. He's in that moment. He's seeing it happen. He's not separating himself from us. And Christ does this. He comes down as a servant to be with us, to see us, to serve. God doesn't hide himself from the sinfulness of the world. He comes down, he sees for himself, and he does the plan of rescue. And so Abram has this debate with God. Will you destroy the whole city? Like, what if there are some righteous people in that city? And you see that whittle down, starting at verse 24 in chapter 18. Suppose there are 50 righteous. Would you destroy the city with 50 righteous? And God says, for 50 righteous, I'll save the city. Okay, well, don't get angry with me, but what if there's fewer than that? What if there's fewer than that? And eventually God reaches the point where he's like, don't ask anymore. You've reached it. But Abram's not afraid to approach. Abram approaches God in humility. He stands before God as a friend, and he intercedes for Sodom. He knows how bad Sodom is. He's not dumb. He lives right in the middle of the he lives right on the crossroads of trade routes. He knows how bad Sodom is. But God has chosen to reveal his plan, so he feels confident to intercede on behalf of Sodom with God. You've told me what you're planning on doing. Let me offer prayers on their behalf. Let me intercede for them. And God eventually says, stop. You're done. 10. If I find 10, then yes, I'll spare the city. On behalf of, because you've interceded on their behalf. Chrysostom said, Abraham truly looked as if he was asking for the righteous, although he was asking for everyone. He wasn't asking just for the righteous people in Sodom. He was asking for all of the people. Will you spare the whole city for the sake of 50? The souls of saints are very tender and loving for the sake of their own salvation as well as those of others. Abram draws close to God, and then he draws close to God on behalf of everybody. St. Augustine said, when Abraham tried to intercede for the sake of Sodom and Gomorrah with no avail, he finally said, I am dust and ashes. I've stood before God. He's already, like, he's given me so much. He's answered the prayers, like, he's answered my intercessions so far. What more can I say? Again, reflection of purity, humility, and love. And Abram's approaching God in humility and love, asking for mercy, receives a promise of love and mercy. God doesn't say, forget you. I just thought I'd tell you so you know how strong I was. And Abram's response is, shall not the judge of all the world do right? I have to trust that you know what I'm dust and ashes. I have nothing. I can't argue this. I can't debate any further. I've said what I can say. I just find that very interesting. Again, archetypal figure in Abram, his faith and his humility and his love for the world are so beyond belief. You want to be like that person. And you see that reaction. You see that in Christ. Like, he comes and he intercedes for the world. He comes and he redeems his own out of the world. Think about, we're going to read that at Passion Gospels. I'm not praying for everybody. I'm praying for my people who are in the world so that the whole world will see that. Jesus says, let your light, let your good deeds be manifest to everyone so that everyone will worship the Father. Jesus isn't just like looking for like those few people. He wants the whole world. So like Abraham, will you do this will you spare the city for the sake of 10 righteous? Not will you spare 10 righteous. Will you spare the city? And not just we think cities, walled cities, but walled cities include farmlands. Walled cities include towns, kind of these various housing and encampments that surround them, that really, like Lot's family. Now Lot, of course, has moved into the city. That's a whole other story. And interestingly enough, Lot is the closest you get to a righteous person in Sodom. He's the closest thing you get to a righteous person. And even then, he's hidden about it. He sees the men come to this, the two angelic visitors come to the city, and he's like, quick, come with me, come with me, come with me, come with me. Like, he runs the grid, come to my house, like, let's just, they don't even have a chance to walk through the city. Lot like grabs them, pulls them in. Yeah, don't be here. And then the people reveal themselves, which is always the case, right? Your sin always reveals itself. In the meantime, the destruction of Sodom, the descendants of Lot, Isaac is born, Hagar and Ishmael are sent away. God's special relationship with Hagar and Ishmael in this moment. It's really a very tender story. God reveals himself to Hagar in the depths of her despair. And he says, I am the God who sees you. Like, you haven't, your mistress cast you out. It was unkind. She cast you out with your son to die in the desert. She's forgotten about you. But I see you. You cried out to me in faith, and I see you. Just even Hagar, the Egyptian handmaiden, by some traditions, Pharaoh's daughter, even she cries out to the God of Abraham in faith, and he comes to her. I like that. There's nobody so far away. There's nobody so prodigal that they can't return out. They can't see themselves in the big pen and turn to God. And then chapter 22, which is where our readings for this week ended, the sacrifice of Abraham. And when I used to teach this, my kids would be like, he didn't really sacrifice Isaac. I completely disagree. Abraham absolutely sacrifices Isaac. His willingness to, that moment where in faith he prepares the altar, ties his son to it, and prepares to kill him. Not because he thinks God wants human sacrifice, but because he believes in the resurrection. I'm willing to give up all of this. He's already sacrificed him. He's given God, well, God didn't need the evidence. Abraham shows to all of us what that relationship with God looks like. Nothing is too great to stand between me and God. And the Father said, and this is not so much a test of Abraham's faith as it is a revelation of Abraham's faith. God knows Abraham believes in him. God knows Abraham has faith in him. God's not concerned about Abraham's faith. God shows Abraham's faith. God shows everybody Abraham's faith. The whole world sees Abraham's faith in this willingness to do this. And just look at the way that, like, he does this. He gets up first thing in the morning and he goes. He doesn't, like, ask advice from his wife. He doesn't talk to somebody else. He doesn't hum and haw with God. God says, get up, take your son, and go. And he gets up, takes his son, and goes. Seeing the resurrection. Again, the fathers always say Abraham does this in faith of the resurrection. Jesus even says this in John's Gospel. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Abraham saw the resurrection of the dead and rejoiced in it. Jesus, this is it. This is the moment of the resurrection. Jesus is saying, the dead will rise. Abraham saw this and rejoiced. St. Augustine said, Abraham never believed that God would accept a human sacrifice. Yet once he heard the divine command to offer his son, he instantly obeyed. Abraham was worthy of commendation, for he surely believed that after offering his son as a burnt sacrifice, he would eventually be risen up. According to God's saying, when Abraham did not intend to abide to his wife's wishes to send the bondmaid and her son away, remember, Sarah says, get rid of him. He says, no. God tells Abraham, in Isaac your seed shall be called. And that is why the father was holding fast since the beginning of the promise of what was to be realized through that son. God had already promised that through Isaac, this world would be blessed. So what's he afraid of? If the promise is through Isaac, then the promise is through Isaac. And it's interesting that the fathers also point out that it is very likely that the place where God shows them to go is actually the place where Christ will be crucified eventually. And that's everywhere. That this hill in this area of Moriah is the place where Christ will be crucified. And been there, it's also where he's buried. Resurrection takes place, all in the same spot. It's great. Isaac never doubts Abraham in this moment. Abraham splits wood and puts it on Isaac's back. He carries the wood on his shoulders. We've seen this before. We'll see it again. Abraham sees the place after 3 days. Like, there's just so much stuff. We're running out of time, and I'm losing. It's like we're in this one chapter. There's just so much revelation of the person, work, and sacrifice and resurrection of Christ. Even to the point where Isaac just implicitly trusts Abraham. Doesn't even question it. Where's the sacrifice? God will provide a sacrifice. We don't see any kind of struggling happening between Abraham and Isaac on top of the hill. Just that Abraham prepared the altar, laid the wood on it, bound his son, put his son on the altar. And at that point, he completed the sacrifice. The sacrifice was complete. And so the ram in the thicket is not to replace Isaac. I hate that. Such a Protestant thing. God sent the ram because he demanded a sacrifice, and there had to be a sacrifice somewhere. So he gives Abraham a ram, because God's a bloodthirsty God. Abraham offers the ram as a sacrifice, but not as a burnt offering, not as as a sin offering, not to appease God's bloodlust, because God gave him a sacrifice of thanksgiving. Abraham takes the ram and offers a thank offering to God because he's shown himself once again faithful. He's received his son back from the dead. God provides the ram for the sacrifice. And we see this sacrifice relationship, obviously again repeated later in Christ's own sacrifice, his own voluntary sacrifice. He's led like a lamb to the slaughter. He cries out to his father, just like Isaac cries out to his father. Father, I have a question. But he's peaceful. He's dispassionate. And God raises him from the dead. God brings him back from the dead. God brings Isaac back from the dead. And Abraham had the knife in hand. He was dead. Abraham wasn't going to stop. God brings Isaac back from the dead. God raises Christ back from the dead. And we offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving. We're about to cross the way and do that. Offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving. Right? Every week. Every liturgy. And so my final thoughts, and I got caught in my notes and missed my St. Mary of Egypt moments. That faithfulness of Abraham. The faithfulness of Abraham causes him to leave everything he knows and understands and follow the God who's revealed himself to him. Even to the point of the hardest thing he's ever had to do, which is trust him to give him a son at 100 years old. I think that was harder for him than the sacrifice. Because there's no sense of Abraham's hesitation. There's not 10 chapters of Abraham hemming and hawing about whether or not to sacrifice Isaac. But there's 10 chapters of Abraham wondering whether or not God's actually going to give him a son. This Egyptian woman comes to Jerusalem not out of faith. She comes from a complete, sensual drive. Oh, there's people there. Huh? Haven't gone to bed with those people. And what she meets there is the living God. God reveals, the mother of God comes to her, reveals her sin to her, reveals the love of Christ to her through the cross. She receives communion, and she goes. She leaves everything she's ever known, and she gives everything she has to God. And as a result of her faithfulness, receives forgiveness for her sins, and her prayers become, all these amazing things that God does through her life. Again, think about that archetypal Abraham. It's almost too much to believe. And yet this is the God we worship. And if Abraham's too much to believe, look at this one woman who, unlike Abraham, has nothing to offer, nothing to recommend herself except her faithfulness. If Abraham can do it, we can do it. Mary of Egypt can do it, we can do it. The cross makes it all possible. It's faith that makes it all possible. And so I lost all my St. Mary of Egypt thoughts. But I think, again, to reiterate what I've said before, these readings for Lent are not accidental. They prepare us for what we're going to hear about that coming Sunday. We've read about a man so faithful to God that he left everything he knew and received rich spiritual and material blessing as a result of it. And through him, all the world is blessed. We're going to read about a woman who literally had nothing to offer God but gave everything she had. Just a life of complete faithfulness and submission. And through whom the world is blessed. I just think that's really special. So, that's Abraham. So next time we get together, we will, it'll be Thomas Sunday. We'll go over the kind of Call of Abraham stuff that we didn't do because I wasn't here. And then we'll pick up again midway through Genesis and see how far